The world ended in a shriek of splintering wood and the roar of an unforgiving sea. For months, the universe of the men aboard His Majesty's ship Wager had been a claustrophobic bubble of damp wood, fraying rope, and the perpetual stench of bilge water and sickness. They were a floating microcosm of the British Empire, a rigid hierarchy of officers, seamen, and marines, bound together by the iron will of their captain and the common enemy of Spain. Now, that universe was being torn apart. On the morning of May 13, 1741, the Wager was already a ghost ship, haunted by the specter of scurvy. Men's teeth loosened in their gums, old wounds reopened, and their bodies swelled with a grotesque bloating. They were sailing through the most treacherous waters on the planet, the furious gales and uncharted islands off the western coast of Patagonia, a place sailors called the Devil's Jaw. They were trying to round Cape Horn, the graveyard of ships, and they were failing. Captain David Cheap, a man whose ambition was as unyielding as his ship's oak keel, stood on the quarterdeck, his hands gripping the rails so tightly his knuckles were white. Rain and sea spray lashed his face, blurring the impossible sight before him. A wall of black rock, wreathed in mist, appearing and disappearing in the mountainous waves. For days a relentless tempest had thrown them off course. Their navigator was dead, their sails were shredded, and the crew, weakened and demoralized, could barely stand, let alone work the rigging. "Breakers ahead!" The cry came from the lookout in the crow's nest, a sound of pure terror that sliced through the howl of the wind. It was too late. The Wager was a puppet of the storm. Captain Cheap barked orders, "Hard to starboard! All hands brace!" But the commands were swallowed by the gale. The ship rose on the crest of a monstrous wave, hanging suspended for a heart-stopping moment between the sky and the sea. Below, the jagged teeth of a reef waited. Then came the fall. A sickening, violent drop that lifted men off their feet. The first impact was a deep, resonant crunch that shuddered through every plank and every bone. It was the sound of a living thing breaking its back. The mainmast, a giant of a tree that had once scraped the English sky, snapped with the sound like a cannon shot, collapsing in a tangled web of rigging and canvas, crushing sailors beneath its weight. The sea, no longer held back by the hull, poured in. It was a hungry, freezing beast, swallowing the lower decks in seconds. Men screamed, prayed, or simply stared, paralyzed by the sudden apocalyptic violence of it all. They were over 10,000 miles from home, shipwrecked at what felt like the very edge of creation. Among the chaos was a young midshipman named John Byron, a boy of aristocratic blood who joined the Navy seeking adventure. He would later be known as Foul-Weather Jack, grandfather to the famous poet Lord Byron. Right now, he was just a terrified teenager, clinging to a rope as the deck pitched at a horrifying angle. He saw men swept away by waves that washed over the deck, their cries silenced by the churning gray water. The ship was dying, and it was taking them with it. But survival is a stubborn instinct. As the Wager was battered against the rocks, its hull slowly disintegrating, a small party of men, led by the ship's gunner, John Bolkey, managed to launch a longboat. Bolkey was not an aristocrat. He was a practical, devout man, respected by the crew for his competence and steady nerve. He saw Captain Cheap, dazed and with a dislocated shoulder, trying to maintain order where none was possible. "To the boats, Captain!" John Bolkey yelled over the storm. "We must abandon ship!" For Captain Cheap, abandoning his ship was a sin second only to treason. The Wager carried not just men, but cannons, supplies, and most importantly, a chest containing secret orders from the Admiralty. His mission, his career, his very identity were tied to the command of this vessel. To leave it was to admit utter failure. But the ship was already gone. It was a wreck, pinned to the reef and being pounded into kindling. The choice was simple: a chance of life on the desolate shore or certain death in the icy water. Over the next few hours, in a desperate race against the storm and the ship's final collapse, the longboats and cutters ferried the survivors from the wreck to the nearby island. Of nearly 250 souls who had sailed on the Wager, only around 140 made it to the beach alive. They landed not as a disciplined naval crew, but as a traumatized, half-drowned mob. They found themselves in a place that God seemed to have created in a fit of rage. They named it, with grim irony, Wager Island. It was a landscape of impenetrable, twisted forests, boggy swamps, and shores pounded by eternal surf. The wind never ceased, and a cold, persistent rain soaked them to the bone. There were no familiar animals, no edible plants they could recognize. It was a green desert, lush and yet utterly barren of anything that could sustain them. The castaways huddled on the beach around a sputtering fire made from driftwood, their naval uniforms in tatters and their faces etched with shock and a creeping despair. Their social order had been wrecked along with their ship. On the sea, Captain Cheap's word was law, backed by the threat of the lash or the gallows. Here, on this forsaken strip of land, his authority was as broken as his shoulder. The true conflict was only just beginning. It would not be a fight against the Spanish, but a war against nature, against starvation, and ultimately, against each other. Two factions began to emerge from the shivering group of survivors. One coalesced around Captain Cheap. He remained obsessed with his duty. His plan was insane, but it was naval protocol. They would lengthen one of the longboats, make it seaworthy, and continue their mission north to rendezvous with the rest of their squadron, as per his orders. To him, the shipwreck was merely an interruption, not an end. He was a man of the old world, of rules and hierarchies, unable to see that those rules had drowned with his ship. The other faction looked to Gunner Bulkey. He was a pragmatist. He saw the madness in sailing north, deeper into enemy territory and against the prevailing winds in a glorified rowboat. He argued for the practical route: sail south, navigate the treacherous Strait of Magellan, and make for the coast of Brazil, a Portuguese and therefore neutral territory. It was a journey of thousands of miles, but it was a journey towards home. This was more than a disagreement over navigation. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews. Was their loyalty to a distant king and a failed mission, or was it to their own survival? Were they still sailors in the Royal Navy, or were they simply men, stripped bare and fighting for their next breath? In the first few weeks, they subsisted on salvage from the wreck: crates of flour, barrels of salted meat, and casks of brandy washed ashore, providing a temporary reprieve from starvation. But the sea that gave also took. The wreck of the Wager was a constant, mocking reminder of their failure, and with each passing day it was battered further, its treasures swallowed by the waves. The social fabric unraveled with alarming speed. Men freed from the brutal discipline of the Navy refused orders. Fights broke out over salvaged food. The camp became a squalid scene of desperation. Captain Cheap, in his rigid adherence to protocol, tried to court-martial a drunken sailor for insubordination. The men laughed. What power did he have here? The breaking point, the moment that turned dissent into open mutiny, came weeks into their ordeal. A midshipman named Henry Cozens, a man known for his hot temper, had an argument with another officer. Captain Cheap, hearing the commotion and believing Cozens to be inciting a mutiny, drew his pistol. Cozens, seeing the captain's rage, turned to walk away. "I am not so big a villain as you think," Cozens muttered. To Captain Cheap, this was the final straw, the ultimate challenge to his authority. Without another word, he raised the flintlock pistol and fired. The shot echoed across the desolate beach, a sound of civilization in the heart of the wilderness. Henry Cozens fell to the sand, a hole in his cheek, and died minutes later. A collective gasp went through the camp. The captain had just killed one of his own men, not in the heat of battle, but in a moment of perceived defiance. To Balky and his followers, this was not justice, it was murder. It was the act of a tyrant who valued his own pride above the lives of his men. That single gunshot shattered the last vestiges of the old world. There was no turning back. John Balky and the majority of the castaways made their decision. They would not follow a man they now considered a murderer into a suicidal mission north. They would take their chances on their own. They formally deposed Captain Cheap, an act of clear mutiny punishable by death. They seized the largest boat, which they had painstakingly lengthened and christened the Speedwell, and prepared for their epic journey south. They left Captain Cheap and a small handful of his loyalists behind on Wager Island, marooned with little more than a small boat and the captain's unshakable, perhaps delusional, sense of duty. As Balky and his 80 followers set sail, turning their backs on their former commander, they were two groups of Englishmen, lost at the bottom of the world, each with a different story of what had happened. Each believed they were the heroes of their own tale, the righteous survivors. Both groups would face horrors that would test the limits of human endurance, and both would, against all odds, produce survivors who would one day return to England ready to tell their version of the truth. The trial that awaited them would captivate the nation, forcing the British Empire to confront a terrifying question. When the rules of society are washed away by the sea, what are men capable of becoming? The story of the Wager was no longer just about a shipwreck. It was about the battle for the soul of humanity itself, fought on a desolate beach thousands of miles from home.